Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Nicole Prause. Last time we talked about so-called porn addiction and also topics related to sex, sexual relationships, and today we're going to talk just a little bit more about porn addiction and pornography, arousal in the brain, the NoFap movement or NoFap groups, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Prause, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Oh, thank you for having me back. I've been following the show. Looks like you've got some great folks on.
Great, thank you. So let me start by asking you, because this is something that last time when we talked about pornography, we didn't really address a very specific question. Would you say that pornography is a super stimulus? Because I hear that from many people.
Super stimulus actually has a really specific scientific meaning that porn does not meet. So generally it's referring to something that has enhanced features beyond naturally occurring stimulus. It's often studied in the animal kingdom and it's not just sexual necessarily, but anything that's kind of above and beyond what normally or naturally occurs with a stimulus. And porn just doesn't come close to sex or masturbation for that matter. That is, when we show people pornography in the lab and then have them interact with a partner, the second there's partner touch, the responses are much higher. So part of the argument for a super stimulus is it's stimulating beyond what's already given or what normally occurs. And that's just clearly not the case with pornography. It doesn't hold a candle to touch.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, let me ask you more about that. And since you're a neuroscientist, are there studies comparing people just watching pornography, just watching it without doing anything, with no masturbation, and people masturbating and having sex?
Almost all of the studies about sexual arousal are just showing pornography where touching is not allowed, or at least we instruct them not to do that. We don't necessarily watch and check, but we tell them not to. I think we have the only data where we actually have pornography viewing in the same study as where people had partnered touch. But even then, you can imagine, like, studying sex in the lab is hard because you can't just say, go have sex. Like, what does that mean? It's very different for every person. Mm-hmm. So in our case, when we say sex, it's actually just genital stroking and just of female clitoris. So it's not sex in the general sense, but that's kind of the most we have in the lab, and that would be our study, and that's partnered touch compared to pornography.
But are there enough studies to establish a comparison there? Or
we need far more in that space, and they're very, very hard to come by because the constraints, especially in the US, around what we're allowed to do in the laboratory are, I would say, unnecessary. That is the barriers to get it done, in part because the protocols don't really exist yet. That's part of why we're trying to do the work. So it's like, how do you argue that you should be allowed to do something and it's not been done before? But also some just puritanical constraints. So for example, labs in the US are sometimes restricted from using freshmen, but sophomores are okay because somehow there's some imagined big transition between, being an 18-year-old at college and a 19-year-old at college for viewing consensual adult pornography in some of our protocols. So examples like that are abundant in the States of just weird constraints on protocols that don't really make a lot of sense sometimes.
But from the studies we have, what can we tell? I mean, is pornography really as arousing as masturbation or sex?
So that's a remarkable shift. The limited studies we have, which are from our lab, as far as I know, the second someone switches from viewing pornography to touching themselves, the response magnitude is not remotely close. That's to argue that it's a super stimulus, like it stimulates beyond what's kind of available from an actual sexual interaction. It's just not close. It's not comparable. I think the people who use super stimulus are generously uninformed and more often motivated. They're trying to make claims, they're trying to create litigation or laws against things they don't like.
So the response is much more pronounced during masturbation, and I would imagine even more pronounced during sex.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of data comparing all of those in the same protocol, which is really what you need. But the data we do have, it's so, the effect sizes are so large, I feel comfortable saying it's probably replicable.
Okay. Does watching more pornography or watching pornography regularly dampens arousal response during sex?
There's no evidence that occurs from a scientific standpoint. If you ask people directly if that occurs, some people will say they've experienced that. But then when scientists have gone in and tried to document that effect, they aren't able to find it. So even from the people who say they have had these negative effects from it, and what that raises is more likely people who are seeking this kind of stimulation out probably had some, or it's as likely that they had some brain difference beforehand. So for example, we see people who are more sensitive to impulsive behaviors when they're younger, ultimately engage in more sexual risk behaviors as they get older. I would say, they didn't have sex interactions that caused the brain to do this. It's like, no, their brain was kind of already sensitized that direction. And we see some of those differences at birth. I mean, these are in infants who couldn't have possibly had, those experiences yet. People are born with predispositions, and that's reflected in brain activity.
Right. But does the brain, I'm not sure what would that mean in terms of neuroscience, but does the brain distinguish between masturbation and actual intercourse?
So it does in some ways, and there are a lot of ways we probably just don't know about because it's not well studied. And the main part that's not well studied is partnered interaction, but also masturbation hasn't been widely studied either. So what we have, for example, there's a difference when another hand is touching your body and rubbing at a certain frequency that activates C afferent fibers that are unique to partnered stimulation. You can't do it to yourself. There's the psychological aspect of feeling wanted that's unique to partnered interactions that you don't experience when you're interacting with yourself by definition. So I think there are some very unique features that make me think we're likely to continue to discover some of the distinctions between those things.
Mm-hmm. So another question about pornography specifically, because this is something that sometimes we hear from pornography detractors. Does pornography have any effect in the kinds of scripts people follow during sex?
That is also kind of a cause-effect issue. People definitely are more likely to view pornography that is consistent with the behaviors they're engaging in. And so the question is, again, like, did they already kind of have a latent interest? Or did they already have the behavior and did pornography release it or cause them to discover it? Like, what's the exact role? And those are really difficult to parse. So it's like if I was kind of interested in bondage and domination issues in general, and then I view a sexual film that has a specific bondage or domination behavior that I was like, oh, that one, like I really like that one, and now I'm going to go try it. And I'd say, well, okay, but there was a latent interest, but the porn actual behavior was novel. So where do we say in that case? Like, was it the person or was it the actual content they viewed? So it is absolutely the case that the scripts people tend to view in porn tend to be more likely to reflect the behaviors they do engage in. But it's not at all clear that that was causative, that they saw the porn and for the first time ever in their life, they start to think about doing this new thing.
Right. And I mean, another thing that sometimes we hear from people who detract porn is that if people watch porn or if they watch it regularly, I mean, the kind of specific accusation varies from person to person, I guess. But if they watch porn, then they can no longer, or from a certain point onward, they can no longer have normal sex. I mean, they don't feel stimulated the same way. They're not able to get an erection, something like that. I mean, is there anything to that claim or not?
If you ask people directly, they definitely make those claims, and that is documented. Like there are surveys where people said, "Did porn do this to you?" And yes, porn did this to me. So people definitely have that belief. I've heard that as well. However, there have now been a series of studies investigating this, a number of mine as well, and we don't find evidence to support that. So, for example, we looked at people in the laboratory, actually measured their penile responses to sexual stimuli. So, if they have this inhibition or if they've been decommissioned by viewing intense stimuli, they should be less responsive. If they viewed more erotica in their day-to-day life, we found the opposite. That is, they tend to be more sensitive. That shouldn't happen if it's desensitizing. Similarly, if we follow people and say, okay, if you've had this interaction with films in the past, how do you interact with a partner in the laboratory? You should say, I'm not as aroused, I'm not as excited. It's the opposite. That is, people who have more real life experience viewing pornography report being more excited to interact with a real life partner. So we think these are likely just proxies for sexual interest. That doesn't mean, though, that someone who views a lot of erotica might have a lot of sexual anxiety. And anxiety is a well-known good predictor of erectile dysfunction. So in general, I say if someone thinks that may be linked, it's much, much more likely that there's an anxiety issue that's not just pornography related. You had some experience that made you nervous, and it's hard to get out of your head, to not think about it the next time.
But that anxiety, does it go attached to, for example, in the case of men, the fact that they might be afraid that they will not be able to perform like the men they see in pornography, or perhaps they don't have the same kind of penile length as the men they see in pornography,
or the muscularity, attractive partners. So in general, there seems to have been a shift over time. There was more documentation of those kind of fears related to body presentation 20 years ago in science. And what I think has happened is, we don't see that documented consistently anymore. Studies sometimes don't find it. They sometimes find the opposite. Like, people who view more porn feel better about their bodies, then that shouldn't happen. If that's the case. And what I think has occurred is, in the past, there were a few houses that kind of selected the actresses, selected the actors. You only saw a few that were really, recycled in a lot of films. And now, with OnlyFans and the explosion of access to these erotic online content, if you have a small penis, you can go online and you see someone else aroused by a small penis just like yours. So I think because the bodies and content have democratized, they really become very diverse. And it allows you now, I think, to not have necessarily that effect of I'm too big, I'm too small, I'm too, all these natural concerns a lot of folks have, to say no, I saw my body on screen and somebody was very turned on by it. And that wasn't happening in pornography 20, 30 years ago, I think.
So nowadays you get more variety in terms of body type. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think there's a lot of debate about that.
Yeah. And I guess that would also work for anxiety in women, right? Because now we also have more variety for the women themselves, right? In terms of body type.
Yeah, and I think we see that in larger media studies as well. I don't do communications research per se, but when I read those kind of things, they'll talk about the representation, and that it really spans everything from swimsuit issues in Sports Illustrated, having larger bodies, and just a broader representation of what an attractive body is. And I think that's useful. It's most people, when they're viewing pornography, they're viewing it 10 minutes ish. It's, as far as what we consume, we see a lot more television, a lot more kind of print walking around during our scrolling efforts than actual pornographic content. So I don't think these are necessarily unique to pornography, but it may reflect kind of that broader societal, broader representation.
Do we know what are the personality traits of people who watch more porn? I mean, is there anything in their personality that predisposes them to watching it more?
A few folks have done studies of just viewing, so not like reported problems viewing necessarily. And it tends to be exactly what you would think. That is, people who tend to be more reward seeking in a variety of areas. So they don't just view more porn, they're also more likely to say, I enjoy swinging, I like an open relationship, I do cuckolding, I am engaged in BDSM. So we call it sexual breadth. So that is, they tend to engage in a lot of other sexual behaviors, not just the porn viewing. And outside of that, like personologically speaking, they tend to be more impulsive. So that doesn't mean if you view porn, you are impulsive, but there's a tendency. So these tend to be pleasure-seeking people. You know, like this is, I'm going to go jump out of an airplane. I'm going to, I was going to say streaking. I don't know if there's any data to support that, but it's the behavior that came to mind. Jet skis, these are folks who like those kind of things, who the novel pleasure, excitement generally is appealing to them in other aspects of their life also.
Right. And I would imagine they would also also score higher on sociosexuality.
Undoubtedly. Yeah. I was like, I haven't looked at those studies recently, but I can't imagine that's not a strong correlate.
Yeah. So, and who are the people who condemn pornography the most? Last time we talked a little bit about the people who identify as porn addicts, and I will have a couple more questions about that for you. But who are the ones who tend to condemn porn the most?
There were some interesting papers written a while back about two groups that were kind of collaborating to oppose pornography, at least in the States. That was religious groups and anti-porn feminists. So there's a split within the feminist community. Some see porn as empowering, useful for women. Others think it's degrading always, or it is abuse at all times. So those feminists actually work with religious groups, which is very unusual. Usually feminists don't find companions and shared values with religious groups, but they do in this case. The third group that's come in that I think is really shifting some of this is manosphere groups. So these are folks who are making money off of the claims that pornography is bad for you. So they say, every time you view, it hurts your brain. Pay me, I'll help you stop. Pay me, I'll reduce your urges. And so they've actually started partnering with these other two groups, creating a weird, because now these are clearly for profit. That's why they're there. That's why they exist. They make a lot of other claims, but these are all for-profit entities. And so now they've created this group where there's religious, anti-porn feminists, and kind of manosphere, for-profit businesses, all kind of opposing pornography.
Are these the same people who tend to believe in porn addiction or tend to identify themselves as porn addicts or not?
I don't think in the first two cases necessarily, but the manosphere groups, absolutely. They tend to be made up of coaches, and their main claim to expertise is usually personal experience. So they don't hold any licensure typically. They don't have any relevant training, but they'll say, I personally was harmed by pornography, pay me and I'll help you stop viewing too.
Mm-hmm. So last time when we talked about what predicts identifying as a porn addict, I don't think we touched on the topic of narcissism. Could you tell us about that?
That's a really interesting one. There was a history of research on kind of pornography and people who think they're addicted, suggesting that they often have a moral conflict. That's they're raised in a conservative household, possibly due to religion, but any conservative household. And so any porn viewing to them was viewed as horrible, and so I must be addicted. But now there have been a couple of us scientists in different studies independently where we find narcissism was a better predictor than moral conflict. And so the way that seems to be manifesting is all these bad things that happen to me in my life. I'm having trouble in school, I can't get a girlfriend, all these negative outcomes. It's all because of porn. Porn did this to me. How dare they do this to me? And that's a very narcissistic kind of, I'm a victim, I do no wrong. And it prohibits, we can get into this more, but I think in part it prohibits the self-reflection that's like, what do I have control over that I can help myself get a girlfriend, help myself do better in school? Because it's a very victim mindset, It's like, I clearly didn't do anything wrong because I'm amazing. So, what has porn done to me, done to my brain?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So another thing that also links to neuroscience in a way, and sometimes I've also heard from people who oppose pornography, and even some who are part of the NoFap movement, and we're going to get into that in a bit, is that the big issue has to do with the fact that pornography induces the release of dopamine, and then they start talking about supposed dopamine addiction and things like that. I mean, is dopamine addictive at all?
Dopamine is long villainized. It seems to be a favorite of these coaches, and not just within the pornography space, incidentally. Like, there are now kind of cheesy books written about demonizing dopamine. Dopamine is involved in everything in our life, kind of from moment to moment. It's involved in coordinating smooth muscle movement. Things have nothing to do with that. It's often confounded. So if you see someone, sometimes they'll refer to dopamine as a pleasure chemical. It was famously in a Nobel laureate effort shown not to be related or not underlying pleasure experiences. It's really about motivation. And so any motive behavior has to do with dopamine. So dopamine is absolutely involved in addictions, but that's not unique. So if you say like, porn provokes dopamine, it's like every motivated behavior provokes dopamine. Like, yes, if something is addictive, it does have to be involved, but that's not a discriminatory element of addiction. It almost is the weakest argument you could make. Dopamine's involved, so it must be addictive. It's like that means almost nothing. It's not a good argument.
But I mean, when we hear people talking about so-called dopamine detox, does that make any sense?
No, there have been a few limited studies kind of looking at this idea of dopamine detox. Like, is that something that happens? And as best we can tell, not really, no. So can you potentially sensitize yourself through anchoring exercises? That is, like if you have a super bland environment, and we can do these with animal studies where we create environments that are really deprived versus enriched. And you can absolutely see more reactivity to enriching environments. That seems true for both the animal models and in humans, but it's kind of like the degree to which you would need to do that as a human, I don't think we can really replicate. This is like sitting in a room with nothing, for extended periods. And the detoxes I often see are like, put your phone aside for a week. That may not be a bad idea. I don't think it's going to change your dopamine reactivity, and there's not good evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. So last time we talked about porn addiction, but what is it that in the scientific literature is called problematic porn use? What is that?
I think of problematic porn use, sometimes abbreviated PPU, is very similar to television viewing that we worked on 40 years ago in science. That is, you can absolutely view enough television that it interferes with your life. It interferes with you accomplishing other goals that you value in your life. It's associated with obesity. We all have a lot of programs helping youth view less television. And in those cases, we're saying there's nothing crazy unique about the TV. It's like we initially, of course, had all kinds of crazy theories about television, most of which have been cast aside. We see the same kind of thing with pornography now, where people, oh gosh, pornography has all these special powers. Probably not. But problematic pornography is, look, you can absolutely spend too much time doing this. You can do it at the expense of stuff you should be doing instead. And so is there a way we can help you engage in things you value more? Can we shift the effort?
Yeah, but in what ways is that different from an addiction? I mean, I was just wondering, because since you mentioned that it could get in the way of us doing what we have to do, like work, for example, wouldn't that be a criterion for addiction?
Yeah, so these lines where we're trying to distinguish, like, what's a problem behavior versus a pathology. So
Okay.
like any of us can have problem behaviors, stuff we should do less in our life. And that may include, like, if I train for a triathlon, I may be super healthy, but my wife is at home, like, you're not providing for childcare. Like, you need to stop bike riding for 5 hours on Saturday and provide care so I can do something for me too.
Mhm.
So we wouldn't consider the triathlon training addictive, but we'd say, like, look, it's clearly a problem in your context. Like, you need to reduce it. So to actually call it a pathology, when you discover what kind of model of pathology it fits best, and addiction was one that was explored early on, then you say, okay, for something to be an addiction, what are the criteria for an addiction? And there are different ideas about that, but there's one by Berridge that's very popular, called an incentive salience theory of addiction. And it requires a number of different constraints. Like, all these things must be met for this thing to be called an addiction. And pornography fails in multiple ways. So, one is kind of the escalation over time. We see lots of studies failing to document escalation when they're longitudinal. The other is a shift from kind of a pleasure experience to a more compulsive use experience. And to be fair, those are expensive studies. You have to follow people at the start of use over a long period. We don't have those data. We don't have any evidence that happens. And people who say they're addicted, they still have a pleasure experience when we show them pornography. So it just fails in a number of different ways to meet criteria for addiction. But that doesn't mean you can't do it in a way that interferes with your life, and somebody could help you, like, do that less.
Right. Right. Do people who watch pornography have a harder time pair bonding with someone?
So there have been some associative studies where they find, for example, people who view more pornography are less likely to be in marriages, less likely to have a desired sexual partner, like access to a partner. But to me, the argument is much stronger for reverse causality. That is, if you don't have a partner and you wish you did, well, it's Friday night, you're lonely, you're like, I think I'll masturbate, I kind of have a sexual urge, got no one to spend it on, like. So to me, there's not good evidence that it's causative. That is, I view pornography, therefore I don't have a partner, therefore I fail to bond with my marriage partner. It really seems, if anything, to be more evidence in the reverse. Like in the case of marriage, we see this a lot where, so I'm also a couples therapist, although I don't see patients currently. And when people aren't agreeing in their desire, we call it desire discrepancy, what do? If you're married and your intention is to be with just that partner, you don't have an open relationship, and one partner is like, I don't want sex that much, once a month is fine with me. And the other partner is like, I would really like sex 3 times a week. You're going to masturbate more, and you're kind of going to be unhappy about it because you're like, I really wish, my partner would have sex with me more often. And I feel a little rejected and, a little less secure in myself. And I'm kind of pissed off because I agreed to just have sex with them, and now they're not having sex with me. So it absolutely makes sense that there would be an apparent relationship between, like, satisfaction in porn viewing and masturbation. But I think it's really in the reverse causality in most of those cases, if not all.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about the research you have done on NoFap groups. What got you interested in that, and how does it link to the manosphere?
We study a lot of topics kind of around there, and I saw a number of studies that were qualitative in nature. That is, they were interviewing people, or they were kind of looking at posts in a general way in their forums for NoFap. And so we wanted to do something quantitative and actually talk to people who had experience there. So we started out doing a pre-registered survey, just an online survey, kind of a simple start to look at what people's experiences had been. We followed up with some systematic analyses, quantifying the content of their forums. And so there had been kind of hints before from this qualitative work that these groups were claiming to save women, but then using them as objects to test their penis out, and saying, kind of some of the same lines as pickup artists. It's like, I need to get laid, I need this, my body needs this, women owe me this kind of language. But it's a little different than the pickup artist. So NoFap was co-founded by two different guys. One of them is a pickup artist and founded a pickup artist forum separately. So it makes sense. Like some of that rhetoric is definitely in there. And so I can talk more about specific studies or the general effects, but yeah, we've had a series of studies now about NoFap.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about the studies then, and then I will probably ask a few more questions about it.
Okay. The first registered study, we just asked folks, do you know what NoFap is? And if you did, we let you in, and then we looked at their experience, like if they had tried to do one of these detoxes, which they call rebooting. And we said, well, what do you consider a relapse? Like, what do you even think that is? Because there's a lot of discussion on these forums where they don't even know. They're like, did I relapse? Did I not? So NoFap was founded as an anti-masturbation movement. That's very clear. All their documentation shows that. They now say that was never the case. That was definitely the case. That was how they were founded. Since then, they've broadened out. So their treatment manual that they send out recommends 90 days abstinence from porn, masturbation, and orgasm as a gold standard. They actually call it the gold standard. I don't know why. I don't know where that came from, but that's what they decided on. So it was relevant, of course, like, what do you think is a relapse? And it was really all over the board. And interesting to me, like, one of the things a lot of people said was a relapse was cheating on your partner. I was like, how does that related to what you're talking about in this group? So there was a lot of diversity in terms of what they considered problematic. And then we said, okay, thinking about if you tried this, thinking about the last time you experienced a relapse, how did you feel? Asked them about different emotions. And the two that really stood out is the most endorsed was shame. So they say it's not a shaming treatment, but that's exactly what it causes. People said they experience a lot of shame. More so than things like sadness and anxiety. They also sometimes reported suicidality. Now, that wasn't endorsed at as high of a rate, but given that this is not an empirically supported treatment, anything that causes suicidal ideation is problematic. So we even had 12 folks out of our, I think, 289 sample that said it was extremely suicidal. So this was just their most recent relapse, saying they had an extraordinarily negative reaction, which is not appropriate. I mean, we shouldn't be offering this, especially, it's offered for youth, age 13 and up is who's allowed on the forums. I don't want youth exposed to that messaging, that if you masturbate, you've ruined your brain and maybe you should kill yourself. I think it's a horrible message for young men. We did a study looking at the violent content, and this study is often misunderstood, so I got to get ahead of it a little bit, that we looked at violent content that contained explicitly violent words. So we did not try and quantify all of the potentially violent posts, but we got them off of the Reddit subforums for NoFap, a comparison forum for Stop Drinking, and another comparison forum that was porn-free, I think was the other one. So another kind of porn-related, but not their program. And it was remarkable how much more violent the NoFap was. And so sometimes I think of all of the posts that we found that were violent, people say, oh, that was over 11 years. That's really few posts, given that. These are some of the worst, though. This is not a survey of all violent posts. There are many, many more ones that, like, I personally know of many, many more that didn't fit the particular search terms that we used for that systematic review. And interestingly, some of the most common targets of those violent posts were other forum users, which I didn't expect. So they were things like somebody comes on and says, hey, I'm really fighting my urge. I'm really struggling right now. Someone chimes in, if you touch yourself, I have your IP address and I'll come shoot you in the head. And I'm like, what? I don't think they actually have their IP address. And even if you did, it wouldn't necessarily show where they were. But those kind of posts have no place in a recovery forum. Like, what is that about? And since then, like, we've discovered we missed an important key term. A lot of them were talking about self-harm and punching themselves in the genitals. So since then, like, I added a punch search term and have updated our database because a lot of those have that kind of violent content. So yeah, we've done a few other studies as well, kind of looking at something called DOT syndrome that kind of started in India and has spread into Pakistan. And then we have a paper in the UK. And it appears NoFap has kind of brought DOT syndrome into the States. So DOT is kind of unreasonable pathological fear of ejaculation. That is, you think you're losing your life force, this is harming me. So it's not a semen retention practice in like a religious sense, but a really like neurotic fear of one's own normal body responses. And it is diagnosed as a pathology and International Classification of Disorders. And so we see a lot of evidence for those kind of posts in NoFap also. So it really seems like they've brought this neuroses into America. We don't need more neuroses.
Yeah, but addressing the main claims made by NoFap groups, of course, they have to do with semen retention. What kinds of claims do they make about that? And are there any real benefits to semen retention?
So they often try and distance themselves from semen retention communities, which is funny because you can see they're often fighting people on their forums that are advocating for that practice, especially if it's for religious reasons. They'll say, that's not what we do, that's not who we are, but then a lot of the argumentation is the same. So I can see there are many scholars who've lumped them together, like NoFap being the same as other semen retention groups, and then others who clearly try and separate them. So there's not a bright line between them in terms of practice, but I know they try to create a line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean about the kinds of claims they make. What do they tend to say about semen retention?
Yeah, I mean the founding one, the way NoFap got actually started was they got the claim off of a bodybuilding forum that were abstaining from ejaculation because they thought it increased their testosterone levels and then would result in increased muscular gains. And the opposite is true. That is, when you're more sexually active, you tend to have higher, on average, testosterone titers. I don't think that's enough to affect muscular gain. It's actually, like, it's still within physiological ranges. Doesn't do anything crazy to ejaculate a bunch. So, as far as we know. So, the kind of central claim, how they were founded, seems not to hold water. And there was some claims related to a Chinese study that was actually recently retracted. And they still sometimes try and link to that study and say, oh, you know, that the core thing still exists in this other Chinese journal, but it doesn't. It's a different study. You know, we explored that. And so the claim is just not well supported. And then the opposite is probably true.
Right. But are there any real benefits to semen retention?
Yeah, I mean, you can hear me struggling a little bit because I was like, not really. So I mean, you could think, if I'm trying to be expansive here, like part of what NoFap seems to be doing is giving men and boys a feeling of control. So I can control my body. I'm the boss. I tell it what to do. I control my urges. And self-regulation is not a bad thing. You know, I mean, that's part of growing up is we learn not to scream when we feel like screaming. So it's you could argue that's not inherently bad, but it's kind of how you go about it. You know, how do you develop emotion regulation? And I would argue as far as I know, there's not any evidence that gaining that kind of mastery, as they often call it, confers any actual advantage or actually impacts like emotion regulation more broadly or anything like that.
Is there anything that happens to people physiologically, for example, when they go for a very long period of time without sex?
A very, very long time, sure. So there are fertility factors in the ejaculate that decrease if you don't come for a very, very long time. But this is on the order of like years. So, so yeah, fair point. If you extend it that far, and similarly, like there is some degradation of the tissue around genital organs that will degrade at a more rapid rate in people who aren't experiencing any kind of sexual stimulation. So it's not just not having a partner, but it's like you're not masturbating. If you do nothing, you know, if you're really hands off, for years periods, you can definitely get degradation of tissues in the genitals because it's a bit of a use it or lose it situation. Like the muscles can degrade, the tissues aren't as pliable. We see those kind of problems.
What distinguishes what happens in the early phases of arousal versus when one reaches orgasm? I mean, at the level of the brain.
We are working on that. The bottom line is we don't know. And there have been only a few studies that have followed the brain through climax. And whenever you see a study make claims about what happens in the brain at climax, you got to be very, very skeptical, because when climax happens, even if the head doesn't move, the face muscles move. All of that creates artifacts that interfere with functional magnetic resonance imaging, that interfere with electroencephalography. And because they're not happening repeatedly, they're very, very difficult to get out of the signals. So when someone says, oh, the brain does this at climax, maybe. Like there's a lot of noise to get through. So we got really interested in the period preceding it, like what happens leading up to it. And part of why this was happening is we were studying women initially, and we normally expect people when they're getting aroused, getting more and more and more excited until something happens and you have a climax. That's how Masters and Johnson wrote it. And one of the measures we had was sympathetic nervous system activity through galvanic skin response, typically measured in the palms or the soles of the feet where there are a lot of eccrine glands. And so you would see these go up and up and up. But then when we'd say, okay, try and have a climax if you can, it fell off. And we'd be like, what was that? Did our instrument fall off? And as we got to digging into this, we think it's a real effect. That is, there seem to be really distinct phases where trying to get aroused is a real effortful experience where you have to pay attention, think of something as sexual, elaborate on it in your mind. And when you try to get to climax, it's the opposite. You kind of got to let your brain do its thing. And the broad thing we think is going on is orgasm in the brain, as best we know, looks a lot like seizure activity. There's a lot of synchronous firing. You don't want to be in that state unless it's safe to do so. And so our suspicion is there's a reduction in cognitive control and a reduction in neural control that has to occur to allow the synchronous firing to trigger. And that seems like a very reasonable kind of safety mechanism where we say, like, okay, are we in a space where this can happen and I'm not going to get eaten by a lion, if you want to go evolutionary, or in a space where, like I'm attracted to this person and they're not going to assault me. Everything is as I want it to be. I feel good. Let's go there, brain. So there really seems to be a shift, and we have reasonable documentation of it in women. And we've just started a study in men. We have 4 right now. And we're looking for a similar kind of signature in guys. We've seen some of it in a couple of male subjects in piloting, but that's what we're really looking to see in part in this new study.
Great. Does pornography activate the same areas of the brain as sex with a partner? And if so, what does that mean exactly?
There's a lot of overlap and also distinction. So they're both mainly activating the salience network areas of the brain. That is areas of the brain that link together to say, like, hey, we need to pay attention to that. We might need to respond to this. That is generally the network that's involved in emotional experiences. So that's ultimately what we think emotions are for. It's like directing our attention and preparing to act if we need to. So both pornography and partnered sex activate those brain areas, at least early on. They prepare us to act. The motor strip areas of the brain, that is, that kind of signify the homunculus, if you've ever seen a mapping, because it's very cortical, very much on the outside. There are areas for the genitals. Those are activated both by viewing pornography, touching those spaces, as well as some actual touching, which is kind of interesting, potentially a mirror issue. But there are also distinctions from things like, I'm having an interaction with a person. I feel that person desires me. That I don't get from pornography. There are touch-specific sensors that are noticing that someone is stroking me in a way that is intended to be sexual or is likely to be sexual. That's a distinct area of the brain. So there are some that may be unique and distinct. I think it's largely overlap. The biggest distinction is in magnitude. That is, someone who's interacting with a partner, all of those salient areas are going to be activated much more strongly. Is, I think, maybe the bottom line.
Right. So, I mean, it's clear, I guess, that psychologically and neurologically, we pretty much distinguish between watching pornography and having sex. Right.
Yeah, there's some clear distinctions, and it's always kind of a hard answer because they're not totally distinct for sure, but they're also not same and just more of. There are some qualitative differences, but it's a largely kind of a magnitude difference for the most active areas of the brain. Right.
Do women really have multiple orgasms?
Oh man, I don't know. So I always say when people say multiple, I was like, what do you mean? When you say multiple, what is a multiple? So if I have a climax, go get a drink of water, come back and have another one 3 minutes later, was that a multiple? If I have one and then I lose my erection and then it comes back and was that a multiple if it was 2 minutes later? Does it have to be on the same erection? Does it have to be? So number one is like, we don't have an agreed on definition of what constitutes multiple. I will say, I don't think this idea that like women can have multiple and men don't, I don't think it's accurate. And in large part, it's because when we were testing women looking at their orgasmic response, about half the women, when they said they were having a climax, we didn't see physiological evidence for it. That is, we didn't see the stereotype contractions that occur in the pelvis. So I don't doubt that they're having fun. I don't want to rain on that parade, but they are not having the same kind of contractions that also elicit things that pace copulation. So some of the things that occur in the body when we have an orgasm cause that refractory period that may allow us or not to have multiple orgasms or have them in close proximity at least. So if half the women aren't actually having these stop signals from I'm going to call it a true climax, a physiological climax, then of course they're going to look like they're having multiple orgasms and the guys will look like they're not. But if we limited it to just women that are having those experiences, I think they're going to look a lot like men. That is, there's going to be a distribution where some people can have orgasms pretty close in time because they have a really short refractory period. That's my guess.
That's very interesting. So let me just ask you about one last topic, and then I will probably have one other final question. Could you tell us about the work you've been doing? And I know this is very early in the research you're doing on this topic, but the work you've been doing on post-orgasmic syndrome. I mean, what it is, what you think is happening there, etc.
Post-orgasmic illness syndrome, we think mainly affects men. It's the experience of having flu-like symptoms for 2 to 7 days after every climax, regardless of how it's experienced. That is, partnered, masturbation, doesn't matter for these guys. There was a history of research in this space that was typically very small samples. One of the leaders in this space, Marcel Waldinger, recently passed, and they had a lot of theories about an autoallergen in the ejaculate. That is, they thought maybe when these guys are having a climax, there's something in their semen that's causing them to react. And as a result of that, they were doing things like auto-inoculation, that is injecting their semen back into themselves. And there were case reports of these things. In general, these studies tend to be just really tiny, not well replicated, and the mechanisms weren't strong. So that is, they were making some guesses, as one does with a rare disorder. You kind of got to start somewhere. But they didn't have great promise, to my mind, as something that was likely to be a solution for a variety of reasons. But in part, it's like, well, the ejaculate didn't just come out. It was in your body before. Like, what is it about it coming out that you think caused the allergic reaction? So there were details like that weren't clear. So our study is recruiting a large sample of men who struggle with this issue and also control men who don't have this issue at all. And we're going to be comparing them on a series of inflammatory cytokines. So we're getting all kinds of data from these generous guys. So we're getting saliva, blood samples, ejaculate samples, and we're looking for differences in inflammatory response that we think likely underlie this disorder. But we don't know. I mean, that's why we're looking. It is considered a rare disorder. That's the funders are from the National Organization of Rare Disorders and the Fulton Family Foundation. So we're very glad to have the ability to do that work. It's very, very rare, especially in the States, to be able to do that.
So let me just ask you one final question then about your work in general. I mean, is it easy to do this kind of research? I mean, in terms of getting grants for it, and particularly in the US, is the cultural context ideal for this kind of research or not?
God, no. So we always have a toss-up because our European colleagues are a lot more free to do this kind of work, but their federal grants tend to be much smaller. So they can ask a lot more of these questions, but they can't necessarily do it in kind of a big science way. But we can't either because we can't get the giant grants here that do exist. So, it's a bit of a toss-up. Most people who get trained to do this kind of work in the States will leave. So a lot of them go to Canada. Because of some of the challenges. We also have a very serious problem with violent threats. So, I've had serious issues around that. A number of my colleagues have, especially related to the study of pornography, less so with some of the other projects. But our religious persuasion is quite strong in the States, and they do not want this work done. If it says anything might be okay about sex outside of marriage, masturbation in general, viewing pornography, if you don't stop doing your work, they will try and stop you from doing your work. And that is a tremendous problem in the States that I don't think is faced to that extent anywhere else.
Right. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, you can always find me at LinkedIn. That'll be there forever. But most of my stuff these days is liberoscenter.com that has a link out to whatever socials we have going. So that's LIBEROS center, all one word.com.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for the great informed questions. I really appreciate that.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per-Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.